Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome. We've covered a lot of just nuances in the creation story, first few chapters of Genesis, but there's even more. So we've talked about the theme of the Sabbath and rest being very important to the Israelite culture that was being taken out of Egypt from slavery, and that theme in the first few chapters of Genesis. But
we did briefly talk about the mention of the plurality in Hebrew of the let's make man in our image thing.
Mm-hmm. We didn't really talk about the chaos waters, though, as in the very beginning where it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters.
Yeah, and that's one of the words I brought up on our conversation with Albert, because it's tovu avohu. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but basically it's like waters out of nothing, like this complete nothingness, which is chaos in the ancient Near East mindset. And if you look at all of the surrounding areas, creation stories, and even just their epics of their gods, like this...
Who is they? Let's back up a second.
Ancient Near East culture. Like any ancient Near East culture.
Okay, so that would include who? Like the Babylonians and Canaanites?
Sumerians, Akkadians, Egyptians.
The Ugarites.
Canaanites. Any of those, like the Mesopotamia area and around. So that area has a lot of themes attaching to the Hebrew Bible and vice versa. But like chaos waters is one of those themes. Like their gods battle chaos, and it's often represented as waters. If you've ever been in a boat during a light storm, like there's you toss to and fro and there's nothing you can do about it. Like you're not going to stop the water. The Hebrew Bible is no exception to that. It has the Spirit hovering over the waters. You get this idea of the Leviathan, the great sea monster. That's also a representation or a theme of chaos in the Bible. So you have this overall theme of chaos waters attaching to a lot of ancient Near East. And whenever you heard water, usually in the ancient Near East, it would be attached to some form of chaos or something that needed, something that was not order. And that's a theme in the creation story is God is, the biblical creation story, God is bringing unorder. He's ordering non-order. So that's another theme there. But it goes further into the New Testament themes of like Jesus walking on water or Jesus calming the storm or
water into wine. I don't know.
Maybe not that, but it could be something we're missing. But even like baptism is maybe some mental connections there.
That's a really cool thought.
Yeah, both baptism and especially Jesus walking on the waters, and not just any water. He's not walking when it's a calm day and the waters are still, but he's walking when there are waves and it is truly chaotic. And so I think that is something that we as Westerners tend to miss in the story of Jesus walking on the water. The fact that it just seems, yeah, on the surface, it's already a cool thing. It's like, how many of us can walk on water? None of us.
I thought you said samurais walk on water.
Only in the movies.
Yeah, Mythbusters display.
Yeah. But Jesus not only did that, but he did it during a storm. So, that's really cool. But that's meant to communicate something. Everything that Jesus did was meant to communicate something to his ancient Near Eastern audience. And when they hear the story of someone walking on water, one, it turns back to a portion in the Bible that talks about God being in command of the waters, in command of the storms, that he is the one who walks upon the water. But also, it's a reference to the fact that in Genesis, God is the one who controls, who calms the seas, who creates something out of this nothing. And there are a lot of people who've said there's like literal water. There's a literal ball of water that existed in the beginning. So there had to be something before creation. There are also verses that talk about God forming things out of nothing. There's Colossians 1:16. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So all things. There was nothing before him. The chaos waters, there was no water, like physical water before him. Then there's also Romans chapter 4, verse 17. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist.
Boom. Creation ex nihilo.
Yeah, and that is the Latin term, ex nihilo, from nothing. There are a lot of people who look in Genesis chapter 1 and they see these chaos waters and they think those are physical waters. They're not physical waters. They are meant to be a callback to what the common culture at the time would have understood to be the chaotic nature of nothingness. There is nothing. What can you even call that? And so what the ancient Near Eastern cultures called, instead of the nothingness, is the chaos waters. And God is the one who called water into existence, actual true water, from this nothingness. And then from that water, he created the rest of the world.
Yeah, the ancient Near East has this primordial waters theme a lot, and like that being nothing, like that being the utter nothingness. I think Tim Mackey uses the expression, you throw a ball of nothing with a ball of nothing in a blender and you blend it all up, and that is nothingness chaos. So that's the idea that they had, not like physical, like we understand water as something completely different.
Mm-hmm. And this goes back to is Genesis literal or is it figurative? There's poetic elements to it, but it's communicating something that existed or that didn't exist in this case. It's meant to communicate an idea.
Yep.
It's interesting that God used that language because he knew that it would be relatable to the people of that time. And it's something that we see as just one sentence in Genesis, but actually has lots of throwbacks to things that we as lay people, like Cody's a freak of nature. He goes and reads those things for fun to understand ancient Near East culture, but I'm not like that. I don't have that context. And so you overlook it because you don't know that context exists. How many other connections like that exist in scripture? It's got to be uncountable, innumerable.
It's still, there's so much, like, I don't know how to create a better term, but there's like this string theory idea with the Bible. There's so much that's connected that we don't see on the surface. Then we get the context of which scripture was written in, and these strings connect to one another, like just the chaos waters. We've gone through the creation event and that being chaos, how that's connected to ancient Near East's creation events and used, and their gods conquered these chaos waters or this non-order. And then you see that pop up, like the splitting of the seas for the Israelites, then the flood story, the walking on water, the calming the storm. Like you see all of these themes that are connected in some way that our culture as 3,000 years, 4,000 years post when these were written, like don't necessarily connect with. There's so many like hyperlinks or string links throughout scripture that if you're not aware of those, and some you can't be aware of. There's so much that you just constantly read, and I'm constantly reading and finding more connections in these other places, and biblical scholarship is coming up with these connections too that we're lost to time. We talked about lost in translation. That's one aspect, and there's also these aspects of being lost in time and not having all these connections.
And I think it's also important to emphasize that the evidence for similar sounding stories outside of the Bible does not discount what the Bible has to say. In fact, if anything, I believe that it actually strengthens it. I know there are a lot of Christians who want to believe that the Bible is this unique thing that emerged and no one had anything remotely close to the stories in it. It's 100% unique. And if anyone else at the time had heard the stories, they would have laughed and guffawed and said, that's nothing like what we have. In truth, what we should expect, if the world really isn't that old, is that these stories were passed on from generation to generation. And as time went on, they became corrupted. They became slightly different. And that is what we see. And then you would reasonably ask, because we asked this of Albert, why would it be any different for the Israelites? And the answer is because Moses literally met with God face to face and could talk to him about anything, spoke to him as one friend to another. And so God could tell him all of these things directly. And so that's, in my mind, one of the reasons why you see such a poetic aspect to this. is because, one, it is highly fantastical. It's incredible, but also because this is something that God talked to Moses about. And God does tend to speak in not riddles exactly. You know the feel. Whenever you hear God speaking, there's so much depth to what he's saying. And that's the depth that you see in a lot of Genesis.
I do also want to bring up, there's a lot of mockery from atheists that will say things like, what's fantastical, and how could a story that old be really accurate? Or like, how could it speak in poetry but also be accurate? How could poetry be a reliable source of information historically? I think that's silly, because in our family histories, I'm sure that our parents or grandparents or whatever have sat us down, or you've looked on ancestry.com and you've seen newspaper articles or something telling the story of your family, but it's from a personal lens of the author. And so they put their own spin on it. They may embellish creatively. Our own families do that. Your great grandpa has renown for whatever thing that he did 200 years. You can't rely on oral tradition to get it right every single time. And yet we have this beautifully preserved book called the Bible. So yes, there may be like poetic elements that make it engaging for the audience, or maybe speak of something beautiful that God has done that people want to show honor and respect to, but that doesn't make it unreliable. And if we can accept what our parents tell us about our family history as being true, even though it may be embellished or poetic or whatever, then we have to accept that this history that we're given in the scriptures is authentic, because it's been proven in so many different ways, thousands of ways, through geography and the archaeology and all of those things. So I don't know. To me, knowing that the ancient Near East stories align slightly, but also are not godly, is very in line with what we know of the enemy and how he twists the truth to make it fit his story instead of God's.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because the similarities are close enough. It does very much feel like an enemy's corruption, or if we want to be charitable, at the very least, someone who doesn't have a measure of true divine guidance, developing stories and making them into legend as time goes on. And so we definitely see that in terms of when you look at a lot of the texts from the Assyrians and a lot of the texts from the Babylonians, especially. When you look at the flood myths that they have and the legends that developed around that, effectively that they did believe in a flood, and the flood story is very similar to Noah's. They don't call the guy Noah. Obviously, they wouldn't call him that. They don't exactly share the same language. But they do talk about how the gods looked down from heaven and for one reason or another was displeased. Usually the meaning is weird. In the Bible, it makes a lot of sense. He sees a lot of sin, and so he says, I feel regret at making man, we will start again. But in the Babylonian story, it's they're making too much noise because there's just too much people. Yeah, he's just annoyed.
Like, I'm annoyed with humans. Let's kill them all.
That's you can translate that into relatable terms, like more often than not with human nature. Like, we can explain our behaviors in deep ways, but a lot of times it gets skated over as something trivial, too much noise. Like, that is a clear alteration of the truth, because it's meaningless. Noise is meaningless compared to sin.
And there does seem to be an attempt amongst all ancient cultures in a lot of ways to boil down the gods to something that is human. Their drives and their wants are understandable to us because they're the same as ours.
And it takes morality out of it. It takes good and evil, and it just makes it be who you want, but be quiet.
Yeah, whichever god you happen to want to serve is the one that you can serve, more or less.
But even that makes sense to me, especially in a spoken word culture. I'm trying to think of.
Oral?
Oh, not necessarily oral either. Something that just a language developed in any kind of culture that has a like written language. It is impossible to describe God in words. You can try. You have this ability to try, and I think that's why there's a lot of confusion in even just the biblical narrative. Is we're trying to describe something that is undescribable to us. Like you see these constant anthropomorphic, like the God reaches down his hand and he takes on human forms, but he's not human. in the sense of God the Father. But you see a lot of narrative that has those forms for him.
This is something that Tolkien liked to talk about, and he talked with C.S. Lewis a lot about this idea, the idea that Christianity is the true myth. A lot of people hear that and immediately their hair stands on end. Wait, what, he called Christianity a myth? No, that's not what he meant. What he meant is that there's an element, a nugget of truth in the various religions that existed throughout the world, that there was some idea, some central feeling that they had that was true. And they warped their gods and their feelings around that. And so we see these ideas about gods becoming human or having some measure of fleshly form, and the tragedy that comes from that, the terrible things that happen. But also this idea of sacrifices. In most cultures, there's this idea of a god sacrificing himself for something, showing a measure of nobility, and there being tragedy there. Balder the Beautiful is dead. There's a lot of that throughout many of these cultures. And you finally get to Christ, and Christ is the one who embodies the truth of that. He's the God who comes down to be amongst us. He really does it. And the way that he does it is not in the way that you'd expect, because that's reality. Reality is rough. It has those hard edges that we don't like. When God comes down, the place that he comes down is not the place that you'd expect. It's in the middle of nowhere. The people that he comes to, this tiny section of the entire world that everyone's fighting over all the time. Why does anyone care about this tiny portion of land? And yet, for some reason, people do, even to this day. And what does he choose to come down as? He doesn't come down as a mighty king or a conqueror. He comes in the form of a humble child who's, for the first few years of his life, running because people are trying to kill him. And then he dies, a death he doesn't deserve, on a cross for your sin, because that's the only sacrifice that is worthy of God to do. It's not some silly infighting in the heavens where gods are gods, but not really, because they have fleshly bodies and you can injure them and their blood turns into stuff. That's not who God is. God is beyond all of that. But when God takes on a physical form, it's with a purpose and a meaning. And he is both fully God and fully man. And it's bizarre and it's strange and it's hard to wrap your mind around. And yet there's a part of it, like C.S. Lewis says, that feels true. And you would expect some measure of that to exist in these ancient cultures. They weren't completely cut off from God, and they weren't completely cut off from the supernatural. So there should be some of these good dreams, as C.S. Lewis called it, these feelings about what is true, but that are distorted because the enemy gets his wins in when he can.
Yeah, and if you believe in the divine council worldview type mentality, like you have these, other deity figures or Elohim, whatever you want to call them, coming up with their own stories to be worshipped, or even if they were noble, pointing back to the true God being distorted over time as well. Like, it makes more sense in that context to me. I know not all of our listeners agree with that, but it makes sense in that context too, that you would have these deities being worshipped and that they would distort it just a little bit to make them look like the creator God or something like that to derive the worship. Because if there's someone greater than these other deities, why would these people worship them?
And the parallels, we touched on this, but the parallels, especially for the flood narrative, are such that it is clear that some measure of truth is in that story. Everyone actually, whether you're a Christian or atheist or Jewish archaeologist, whatever background you happen to come from, pretty much everyone agrees that there was some kind of flood. Now, there are some people who go overboard with how mundane they think they're like, oh, the Nile probably flooded every once in a while, and so they came up with this flood narrative, and somehow everyone adopted it, like literally everyone. The Chinese, the Polynesians, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, the Greeks and Romans, everyone had a flood myth. And the details of these flood myths all line up fairly well. Now, you can say that, yes, there was this like central story maybe that happened and then it got corrupted over time. Yes, I think we can all agree on that. But the point is that when you look at the Bible story and then you compare it to all of these other ones, one, it feels a lot more grounded and they have a lot more details in the biblical flood story that you can actually look at. But two, just the fact that you have all of these details that line up, it lets you know that there is something to this story. And all of the details are very strange. Like even the bit about there being too much noise. You think that's funny. Yeah, why would God kill everybody for there being too much noise? Well, it turns out the reason that there's too much noise is because everyone is immortal. There is no death in that early world. And you have kings. The Babylonians claim to have knowledge prior to the flood, which is why they believe they were so powerful and so capable. And they claim that because they believe that there were kings who lived before the time of the flood that they could draw their lineage to, who were giants. They believe that they were Nephilim, effectively. And so they were living for tens of thousands of years and reigning for tens of thousands of years, and then God wipes everything out. And then they still have that line that traces back to before the flood, and they have that secret, forbidden, incredible knowledge as children of the Watchers and whatnot.
Yeah, the Anunnaki.
Mm-hmm. Everybody had different names for this stuff, but everyone believed, like the Native Americans called them the Star People. Like the idea that there were these supernatural things that came down and made hybrids with humans. And that sounds weird. I understand. It sounds really weird. And yet, one, it's something that the Bible talks about, though Albert would disagree. Also, hi, Albert, we love you. But it seems like that's something that the Bible's discussing. And in the ancient Near Eastern culture, it's something that everyone just accepted. Michael Heiser writes a lot about this stuff in his books like The Unseen Realm. And he has a lot of other books. I'm still most of the way through Unseen Realm, but Cody's read a lot of Heiser's work.
Yeah, he talks about it a lot.
And for good reason, because it's everywhere in the ancient Near East. And it does seem like what the Bible is meant to do is correct a lot of the nonsense that's being said.
It's almost like the ancient Near East stories are primitive, like small-minded human stories from days of old. This idea of like cavemen, where they had primitive ways of communicating and primitive storytelling and primitive art. You have this primitive story that gives a partial example of what God did, but it makes it focused on the ground instead of the sky thing. Like you don't get an understanding of a God-ordained purpose in the story. And so it's much more about people and humans and life on earth than it is about eternity and God and goodness. And I think that's an important differentiation because people get caught up in those stories because they're maybe mystical or exciting, but they're not actually true. If you can't find the higher meaning in it, the God meaning in it, it's easy for me to discount it and discredit it and not trust it. But for some people, those traditions are fascinating and they get sucked into the human side and the powers that are promised or the authority that is claimed by humans that we don't maybe have. I think it's important to look for that higher power in it, not just the mankind things, because that's going to help you authenticate it in your journey if you're looking at ancient Near East history and trying to obtain biblical context. The ancient Near East stories eliminate God's authority and divine power. You're focusing on something that is done by gods, but their form is different and their purpose is different. It's typically focused on humanity in terms of pleasure or greed, but it's not like God's authority on morality.
And did you connect that to like modern culture at all?
Yeah, because people are obsessed with the occult now. And it's easy to think, oh, I'm going to get powers from this rock or whatever. And it has nothing to do with actual biblical goodness. It has more to do with the promise of power in a human being.
And I think that's the reason why the study of this, like the ancient Near East in the Bible, is like, it's called comparative studies. So I think that's why a lot of Christians are scared of comparative studies, is because there is that like occult aspect that, you know, oh, if I start reading this, I'm just going to get sucked in and believe in the Anunnaki and the Baal cycle and all of this stuff. And I'm just going to get sucked in. And that's a possibility and something we've talked about with. We are open to the idea of contextual and comparative studies, like with the Book of Enoch and Jubilees and the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, but not in the aspect of you're going to go into that with the same mindset that you have for the inspired Word of God, the canon that we have. Like you can't go into that mindset. If you're going to put the Book of Enoch on the same level as the Bible, even if you believe that the Book of Enoch is inspired, you can't do that, because then you become obsessive about it and you put way too much weight in it. And then this line between inspired Word of God and comparative studies becomes even more blurred, and you start believing, if the book of Enoch's not in the Bible, what else is hidden from me? What else did they take out of the Bible?
Yeah.
What else from this ancient cultures is true? And then you start looking for meanings that aren't there in these other narrative stories, and you're like, oh, what if this is true?
But I think for me, I guess it could be, there's two sides to every coin, right? So I guess you could get sucked in. But for me, doing these studies, and I don't go in as deep as Cody does and as Ben does, but doing some of these studies and comparing some of these stories, I grew up in a very occult enriched household. Like, it was very scary and very pagan. And I grew up hesitant to read the book of Revelation in the Bible because I was scared of the mystical sounding things in it, and I didn't understand it. And for me, it's actually been very helpful to go into this type of study because it's taken the fear out of it for me and made me see where that's ridiculous. That has nothing to do with God. That's not God's nature. That's not God's love for people. That's not reflective of God's plan and purpose for what is written in the Bible. And it's been easy for me to say, what do I need to keep and what do I need to throw away? And that, to me, is something I can throw away comfortably, and I don't have to go in any deeper. But at least I know, because I've studied it, because I've looked at it, because I've talked to Cody and Ben about it. At least I can comfortably say, I don't need that.
I think there are a lot of Christians who simply want to arrive at the destination. They just want God to pick them up and put them down where they're supposed to be. And I'm guilty of that too. And that's where I was for most of my life. I didn't want to do any kind of outside studies or comparative analysis or anything like that. I didn't want to learn about the cultures of the ancient Near East. I didn't want to dive deeper into the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha or any of the documents that the Jews at the time of Christ would have valued, that would have taught you a bit more about the cultural context going back even to the time of the Exodus. I didn't want to know any of that stuff. I figured the Bible tells me everything I need to know. It's a low context book, so people like me can just read it and we'll know everything we could possibly know, and God knows everything, so why wouldn't he put literally everything we need to know in this book? I will just read this, and that'll be it. And God will put me at the final destination, and that I'm done. I don't need to make any mistakes. I don't need to fall. I don't need to stumble. That was reasoning that was coming from pride. I didn't want to stumble. I didn't want to make mistakes because, one, mistakes are humiliating. They are. We don't want to be slapped in the face by somebody who knows that we're obviously wrong and be laughed at and say you're wrong. That's horrible. That's a terrible experience. But also, there's always the risk that when you're stumbling on the path, you do something very wrong. You make a critical mistake. And you should live in fear of that. That is working out your faith in fear and trembling. That's what God means when he tells you to do that. If all you need is just the Bible and there's no additional context, and if you've been listening to us by now, you should know there definitely is context. The Bible is a high context book written for people who already knew a lot of things. The Bible is a response to these myths of old, to these peoples who were spouting primitive nonsense that was based on a grain of truth. He was correcting them. There is actual value in knowing those things, because how would you know what these waters are if you didn't know about the chaotic waters? That God is correcting their understanding, drawing from that understanding and shepherding people to the truth based on what they know, meeting people at the time where they're at. There is value absolutely in reading the Bible from a low context perspective, but ultimately it is meant for people who are doing the effort. It is meant for you too. I shouldn't say that. But you get the most out of it when you know the most about the context. And unfortunately, the effort that goes into learning about that context will cause you to make mistakes. But as long as you are seeking the Lord in fear and trembling, and you keep your heart teachable, you'll be able to recover from those mistakes. And I guarantee you, all of us here make mistakes. We're making mistakes now, probably. We're going to look back and think, dang, we should have done more. I know that our episode on hell was one I'm not super proud of on my part, because I think I made a lot of mistakes in that. And then we do the episode on Sheol immediately after. I'm like, that would have made a much better episode both on heaven and hell. We should have had all of this information in that. And Cody and I were talking the other day, if only we could go back and do more, because that the thing that we're the most passionate about now is apparently something that nobody cares about, but we would love to talk more about it. Seriously, nobody listened to our episode on Sheol. Nobody knows what Sheol is. And yet that whole idea, that premise of that episode came from learning about context, about why Jesus is giving a parable talking about Gan Eden and Gehenna. That's literally the places he's talking about. And if you're listening to this and going, okay, what are you talking about?
Go listen.
Well, go listen. And also, what was Jesus talking about? Why have you never asked that question? Why do you think you go to hell when you die if you're an unbeliever? But then Jesus is talking about this place called Hades, and a portion of it that they would have called Gehenna. Did hell already exist? Are we all going there? Why are we going there before we're judged at the end? Why is there a lake of fire? Is the lake of fire different from this place? These are all questions I never asked.
There's this common theme, and most of the context I speak from in modern days is from an American cultural context, but like people will say, well, if God wanted me to know it, he would have put it in more detail. The Nephilim, like if he wanted us to know about it, he would have given us more detail about it. And these people are the people who are so adamant that the Bible has no errors at all in it, like completely inerrant, like perfect, no spelling, no grammatical, anything like that. Super traditional biblical inerrances. Nothing wrong with that. But to be a biblical inerrantist and this is in the Bible, but it doesn't really matter because God didn't tell me about it. Like it is so just, it doesn't make sense to me. Like
you can't pray to have the mind of Christ and not look at the mind of Christ. It's like in a relationship. And the whole point, just so that everybody knows, just so that we're clear, the whole point of this type of study is relationship with God. So if I want the mind of Christ, if I want to understand God's mind, which is inconceivable because he's God, but if I want to at least try, because it's a relationship and it's a loving relationship and it's a mutual, goes both ways relationship. If I want to get to know Cody because I'm interested in him as a spouse, what comes out of his mouth is different than what gets written by his hand, is different than what he sees with his eyes, is different than what he tastes with his mouth. If I want to know the mind of Cody as my husband, I have to explore all of his senses and all of his experiences, and I have to try to get in his head. How am I going to get in his head if I'm taking what comes out of his mouth and that's it, or what's written with his hand and that's it? There's so many other parts, and you can't have a good perspective on God's identity and how to have a relationship with him if you're not passionately pursuing his mind in all aspects. That's complicated and it's not easy and it takes a lot of work. But do you want to be spoon-fed water, or do you want to get into the meat of the relationship and actually miraculously experience God?
It's a hard position because the end of the Gospel of John talks about the things that Jesus said and did, and there not being enough paper to contain his life, basically. That's a Cody paraphrase. But like the same is true about God. Like you can't think the entire character of God is in the Bible. Like it is not. God transcends the Bible. I know that's baffling to some people who it's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Bible, but God transcends the Bible. The Bible is not God. So that doesn't mean everything that we read outside the Bible is automatically pointing to the character of God, because there is people who, this chair is God. I am God, you're God. So it's not this Hinduistic view of God where everything is this oneness mindset and we're all part of God collectively. No. And that's why we have canon.
So knowing what we know, and because we've gone on a tangent here of comparative study, but knowing what we know about just the chaos waters in Genesis, what does that tell us now as our family history? What do the chaos waters tell us today?
So when you're doing comparative study and seeing this theme pop up, and culturally God is conquering these waters, it's connecting to the cultures around that time of this is the real one conquering the chaos, the non-order. So there's that. But as far as like church goes today, like doing that comparative study to get that knowledge of the themes that go beyond just what we're seeing from an American standpoint connects and makes the text so much richer for just your everyday life.
And widening the scope a bit farther out just from the chaos waters, but just this general period in Genesis, it seems almost like we're not touching on church history at all. But we are. We're actually reaching all the way back to the very beginning, to the point where God and man were directly connected, where Christ himself walked with Adam, and they were together, and they spoke as one friend to another. You were in the physical presence of God always. And then we were separated from that. And from that separation creates the need for a church of sorts, one we don't actually get for a very long time. We don't really get anything remotely resembling a church until the time of the Exodus, where finally we create this holy place, this tabernacle, where there is a form of worship for God and these followers of God, these tens of thousands of Israelites wandering the desert, this basically portable church. But looking back to this time period and doing the reason we're going into all of this comparative analysis, you'll get a very different image of God and the kind of trajectory of history of the church and of the world if you don't know a lot of these things versus you do, or you do believe a lot of these things versus you don't. If you believe that essentially God created everything, but then he chose just a handful of people to reveal himself to, and he abandoned the rest of the world. Why did he do that? If you go purely based on what the Bible says and what it alludes to, then like I did for a very long time, you're left in the dark. There's no context for the decision. God just abandoned everybody, and he chose the Israelites as his one church, his people that he had connection with, and he abandoned everyone else. Why? Why did he not love everyone else? If God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, he didn't love that part of the world. But if you look at it in terms of the context, in terms of what it is that the Jews believed about this time period, well, not all the Jews, because they weren't a monolith. You see a lot of diverse discussion, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There were Jews who didn't even believe in the supernatural, oddly enough. But when you look at a lot of the things, the gaps that are filled in by writings like Enoch and filled in by the ancient Near Eastern culture, what is that God didn't abandon the rest of the world. He let his creation govern itself. He has set aside the sons of God, the angels in heaven, to point to him. As it says in Deuteronomy, he divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God. They were supposed to reign over his creation, looking over itself. You see this incredible kind of series of proofs that God is giving the world for why he needs to be the ultimate judge. In the beginning, there is no order. Everyone does as they see fit, both his creation in heaven and his creation on earth. And a whole bunch of terrible things happen. And as a result, God needs to wipe everything out and start again. Effectively, there are no rules or regulations, just what's in your heart. And it turns out that the hearts of both men and angels were not guided by God as fickle. And then the flood happens and everything starts over again. But this time there are nations, there are peoples. If one goes bad, not necessarily all of them will. And now the angels in heaven have a job. They are meant to reign over as princes. It's principalities is what Paul refers to as principalities. These are the princes of these various nations. And they are meant to point to God. But God sets aside this one tiny portion of the world that he will reign directly, to ensure that there is always a presence of God, a presence of something good on this earth.
Yeah, it's not the promise that the people are going to be perfect angels, because they suck. The Israelites made so many bad choices.
Mm-hmm. And it's God that's constantly bringing them back. So imagine what the Israelites would be like if they didn't have God there.
Yeah.
And just that the rest of the world, like this is where I'd part with a lot of the open theistic mindset is God knew what was going to happen. He needed to have his own portion that carried on the true story outside of these principalities.
Mm-hmm.
The preservation of scripture wouldn't have been possible without the Israelites. We wouldn't have the richness of history that we do without them.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, at the very beginning, no rules, no regulations, no nothing. It descends into chaos. It descends into death and destruction and evil. All of it's wiped out, and then we get some rigidity. Heaven ruling over earth to a degree, but God not directly taking control. People having the freedom to do more or less what they want, and yet it turns out that still what they both want is evil. And then the time of Christ comes. God sacrifices himself for the sins of the world, and he rules the world now, and yet he still is letting us rule more or less as we want. Now, without all of that influence of the angels ruling over the world, he rules the world. He has removed that influence over us, and now it's us. It's our own influence. Yes, there's still some supernatural influence from what we can see. You still hear stories about possession and whatnot, but as we discussed in our episode on demons, it feels neutered.
Definitely.
Especially in comparison to the stories definitely at the time of Christ, when you see the hundreds of people who are having demons driven out of them at the time. That's just not something we see very often today. We have God's protection more or less throughout the world. A lot of that influence is removed, and still we turn our back on him. Now there are so many people who say the supernatural doesn't exist. Why should we care? There's nothing.
There's this theme, and a lot of people at this point, like, why? Why do we need these steps? Why do we need Israel? But you see this constant theme stemming from the creation story. You have God walking with man, and pretty much everybody being of their own free will. But then you have this stem of pride, like, I don't need God. Do you really need God? I can be God myself. So you have what is coined as original sin. And then it stems out from there of that degrades to the flood story. And then after the flood story, you have the principalities mindset. Okay, so angels or other deities can guide us better. So let's do that. And then it progresses farther. So then you go through the tabernacle phase. So we'll have God, but it'll be through one specific man or the prophets. And then you got the judges. And you see this progression. Goes through Moses as a prophet, judges, kings. But you see this digression of people and leadership. And what is all of this to say? It's to point to we need God. We need to be ruled by God. We can't do it by ourselves without it degrading. And we've, at the point of the end times, we will have tested every theory that there's nothing that we could possibly think of a better way to do it ourselves. We've tested every form of rulership outside of God directly, that there's no way there's a better option. And to me, that's how there can still be a free will mindset without somebody being like, if we tried it this way. No, we're going through these, basically a dispensation of leadership from like deities to prophets to judges to kings to presidents. Like you see this unfolding of how we think we can rule the world better. And it's no, we need God.
And there does seem to be this constant appeal, this desire for an intermediary. God offered to speak to all of the Israelites directly, and he does that a grand total of one time. And everyone is, no, let Moses talk to you for us. We don't want this. This is terrifying.
Crap, you're scary.
Yeah, because God in his fullness is scary. You may think that you desperately want to hear from him directly. Maybe you do. But answer honestly, what do you think would happen if God in his fullness came in front of you? Just arrived in all of his infinite glory?
I can tell you what I did in the throne room. I stomped my stupid little foot and he laughed at me. And then afterwards I was like, crap, I made a mistake.
The Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the Germans open the Ark of the Covenant and like their faces melt and stuff. That's what I envision.
There are moments in my life where I have come close to experiencing a fraction of God's glory, just being somewhat in his presence, not physically, but feeling that. And it's terrifying because you're not worthy of that. What are you? You're nothing. And so you're in God's presence and it will affect you profoundly in one way or another. And if you don't have Christ as your intermediary, the one who can take that burden for you, who can remove the things that make you unworthy and let you be worthy to stand before God and kneel before God and worship before God, the only intermediary worthy of God is God. And the only intermediary you should appeal to God is God. And that is going back to this kind of, again, what C.S. Lewis called good dreams. The Israelites wanted an intermediary. They knew they weren't worthy to stand before God. God terrified them. And then you get to the time of the judges, and there's still this intermediary, and there's this endless cycle, because any time that intermediary disappeared or died or went bad, The Israelites went off the deep end once again. And then you get to the time of the kings. The kings effectively remove the intermediaries altogether. We don't want God to be our king. We want a king, a human, a person to be our king. That's what God even says to Samuel. He says, don't worry. This is them rejecting me as their king and wanting one of their own to be king. We want a kin, something that's familiar to us, to be our king. And that is who Jesus is. He is our kinsman redeemer. He is the God who became man and dwelt among us and died for us. And he is our intermediary, God himself. So all of these feelings do appeal to something that is true, but they were in and of themselves corruptions, because we shouldn't want a human being to stand between us and God and tell us what it is that God is actually telling us. You should turn to Christ. He's the one who can do it.
If inside of us was an ocean, it's full of chaotic nothingness until salvation, and then God does something with it, creates something with it. Like being a born-again Christian, being reborn out of the water of baptism. Like God is working in us, and this theme of chaos waters throughout Scripture has been brought to completion in us through our salvation. And that is a beautiful thing. If you can tie it back to the very first day of creation to today, that is the connection that we have with God.
Yeah, I like the connection there with baptism, and like the way you hear, especially the dramatic testimonials of people, that their life was literally chaotic, and then they're baptized, and they're in this chaos waters, and the Lord is hovering over that water, and they're like pulled out a new person, like no longer disordered, no longer chaotic, but peace, calm, and order. And they have purpose for their lives.
And you can backslide. You can struggle, and there are going to be bad days. There's going to be seasons where you're like, why? But ultimately, you know the truth now, and you have the choice to make to retain that order that God has instilled in you, or to backslide into the chaos. You can fall back in. It's amazing. That's our heritage. That was preserved for us through civilizations writing adjacent stories to what God really did. And that's amazing for church history.
Yeah, and church history, a lot of people get this mindset that the Old Testament was written by the Israelites, only for the Israelites. There's no Gentile message at all in that. And I think that's a poor mindset too. If you read Isaiah, it is noted as the fifth gospel for a reason. Like, it is very Gentile centered and gospel message for people outside of Israel in the new kingdom, so to speak. And then, we've been talking about comparative studies. So you see the connections of the chaos waters. We're still on that topic. So the chaos waters and that imagery being used to connect to the surrounding nations. If it was just for Israel, why would they use imagery from these surrounding nations? It was to speak to them. Like, it was to connect with those people. No, my God's the real God. This is why. And not just for the Israelites. So history carries on, and we'll continue to go through that for the church.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.